Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The yellowed pages crackled beneath Dr. Margaret Whitmore's careful fingers as she navigated through the dusty archives of the Louisiana Historical Society in the autumn of 1987. What had begun as routine research into antebellum transportation records had taken an unexpected turn when she discovered a leather-bound ledger tucked behind a collection of shipping manifests from the 1830s. The book's spine bore no title, only the faded impression of what appeared to be a ferry wheel etched into the worn leather. The ledger belonged to the Bayou Teche Ferry Commission, a now-defunct organization that had overseen river crossings in the remote parishes of southern Louisiana during the early 19th century. Dr. Whitmore had been searching for documentation related to the economic impact of ferry services on plantation commerce, but the entries she found defied conventional historical records. The handwriting, though elegant in its execution, carried an underlying tremor that suggested the scribe's growing unease with each successive entry. The first anomaly appeared in an entry dated March 15th, 1833. The commission's secretary, one Jeremiah Blackwood, had noted the arrival of a new ferryman named Samuel Godfrey. Unlike typical employment records, this entry contained unusual details about Godfrey's appearance and demeanor. Blackwood described him as a man of indeterminate age, possessing an unsettling pallor that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the Louisiana sunlight. His eyes, according to the secretary's meticulous observations, held a depth that suggested familiarity with waters far darker than the muddy currents of the Teche. What struck Dr. Whitmore as particularly odd was the absence of any prior employment history or references for Godfrey. In an era when such documentation was essential for positions of trust, especially those involving the safe passage of passengers across treacherous waters, the commission had apparently hired him based solely on a brief interview. Blackwood's notes indicated that Godfrey had arrived at the ferry landing on a morning shrouded in unseasonable fog, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and an intimate knowledge of the bayou's most perilous currents. The ferryman's vessel, described in subsequent entries, defied the typical construction of Louisiana rivercraft. Rather than the sturdy, flat-bottomed boats commonly used for such purposes, Godfrey operated what Blackwood termed a peculiar craft of ancient design. The boat appeared to be constructed from a dark wood that none of the local carpenters could identify, and its hull bore intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of observation. Passengers who boarded the ferry often commented on the vessel's unusual silence as it moved through the water, cutting through the current without the typical sounds of wood against wave. Dr. Whitmore found herself increasingly absorbed by the secretary's growing concern about passenger complaints. Beginning in late March of 1833, travelers began reporting strange experiences during their crossings with Godfrey. The journey, which typically took no more than 20 minutes to traverse the narrowest point of the bayou, seemed to extend indefinitely under the ferryman's guidance. Passengers described losing track of time, finding themselves surrounded by waters that bore no resemblance to the familiar Teche, and experiencing a profound sense of displacement that lingered long after reaching what they believed to be their intended destination. The most disturbing accounts involved passengers who claimed to have seen other travelers aboard the ferry who simply were not there. Families would board together, only to discover during the crossing that a member had vanished, leaving no trace of their presence except for a lingering sense of loss that the remaining passengers could not explain. When questioned about these disappearances, Godfrey would respond with a silence so complete that it seemed to swallow the very air around him. Blackwood's entries revealed his mounting frustration with the situation. Despite multiple attempts to investigate these claims, the secretary found himself unable to substantiate the passengers' stories. The ferry's manifest, meticulously maintained by Godfrey himself, showed no discrepancies. Every passenger who had purchased passage was accounted for, their names recorded in the ferryman's precise script. Yet the complaints continued, growing more frequent and more disturbing with each passing week. As Dr. Whitmore delved deeper into the ledger, she noticed that Blackwood's handwriting began to deteriorate. The confident strokes of his earlier entries gave way to increasingly erratic penmanship, as if the act of recording these events was taking a physical toll on the secretary. His final entries from April 1833 spoke of sleepless nights and dreams filled with dark waters that called to him with voices he recognized but could not place. The chapter concluded with Dr. Whitmore's growing realization that she had stumbled upon something far more complex than a simple historical curiosity. The ledger represented a window into events that challenged conventional understanding, and she found herself drawn inexorably toward the mystery of Samuel Godfrey and his impossible ferry. Dr. Whitmore turned the brittle pages with increasing fascination as Blackwood's entries from late April 1833 revealed the Commission's first formal investigation into Samuel Godfrey's operations. The Secretary had documented a series of interviews conducted with passengers who had traveled on the ferryman's vessel, and their testimonies painted a picture that defied rational explanation. The investigation had been prompted by a particularly disturbing incident involving the Beauregard family, prominent plantation owners who had attempted to cross the bayou on April 20th. According to Blackwood's careful transcription, the family of 5 had boarded Godfrey's ferry in broad daylight, witnessed by several dock workers and a local merchant who had been waiting for the next crossing. The journey should have taken them to the eastern bank, where their carriage waited to transport them to a neighboring parish for a wedding celebration. The family had never arrived at their destination. More troubling still, when the merchant boarded the ferry for the subsequent crossing, he found no trace of the Beauregards aboard the vessel. Godfrey, when questioned about the missing passengers, had produced his manifest showing that no family by that name had purchased passage that day. The dock workers, when pressed for details about what they had witnessed, found their memories strangely clouded, as if a fog had settled over their recollections of the morning's events. Blackwood's investigation revealed a pattern of similar disappearances, stretching back to Godfrey's first week of employment. The Secretary had painstakingly cross-referenced passenger complaints with local records, discovering that at least a dozen individuals who had been seen boarding the ferry had subsequently vanished without explanation. Their families reported them missing, but official searches of the bayou yielded no evidence of drowning or foul play. The missing passengers had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only the fading memories of those who had watched them step aboard Godfrey's peculiar vessel. The Commission had attempted to conduct a formal inspection of the ferry itself, but their efforts were consistently thwarted by circumstances that seemed to conspire against any thorough examination. Weather conditions would deteriorate without warning whenever inspectors approached the dock, or essential personnel would fall inexplicably ill on the appointed days. On one occasion, Blackwood himself had arrived at the landing to find the ferry completely absent, despite having confirmed Godfrey's schedule the previous evening. The ferryman had appeared later that afternoon, claiming to have been conducting routine maintenance in a secluded inlet that none of the local watermen could identify. Dr. Whitmore noted that Blackwood's writing style had begun to change during this period. His typically formal prose gave way to more personal observations, as if the Secretary was struggling to maintain professional objectivity in the face of increasingly inexplicable events. He wrote of dreams that plagued him nightly, visions of passengers standing at the edge of dark waters, their faces turned toward something beyond the horizon that filled him with inexplicable dread. The investigation took a more disturbing turn when the Commission decided to place an undercover observer aboard one of Godfrey's crossings. They selected Thomas Meridian, a former river pilot with extensive knowledge of the bayou's geography and currents. Meridian's mission was simple: document the exact route taken by the ferry and report any irregularities in the crossing procedure. Meridian had boarded the ferry on the morning of May 3rd, 1833, carrying concealed instruments for measuring distance and direction. According to his subsequent report, transcribed in Blackwood's increasingly unsteady hand, the crossing had begun normally. The ferry had departed from the western dock at precisely 9 o'clock, with Meridian among 6 other passengers making the journey to the eastern bank. Within minutes of departure, however, Meridian had noticed that his compass began behaving erratically, its needle spinning without settling on any consistent direction. The familiar landmarks along the bayou's banks seemed to recede into an unnatural distance, and the water beneath the ferry took on a quality that reminded him of liquid obsidian rather than the muddy brown of the Teche. The other passengers appeared unaware of these changes, sitting in perfect stillness as if entranced by the rhythmic motion of the vessel. Most disturbing of all was Meridian's observation of the ferryman himself. Throughout the crossing, Godfrey had remained motionless at the vessel's stern, his hands resting on a steering pole that never touched the water. The ferry seemed to navigate the increasingly unfamiliar waters of its own accord, following currents that existed beyond the physical realm of the bayou. Meridian had attempted to mark their progress using his instruments, but found that time itself seemed to flow differently aboard the vessel, stretching and contracting in ways that rendered conventional measurement meaningless. The crossing had concluded with the ferry arriving at what appeared to be the familiar eastern dock, but Meridian's instruments suggested they had traveled a distance far exceeding the bayou's actual width. More troubling still, when he disembarked and looked back at the vessel, he could have sworn he saw additional passengers aboard the ferry who had not been present during the journey, their faces pale and their eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the visible horizon. Doctor. Whitmore discovered that Thomas Meridian's full report occupied nearly 20 pages of Blackwood's ledger, written in a cramped script that suggested the secretary had been working by candlelight in the early hours of morning. The river pilot's account, as transcribed by the increasingly troubled commission secretary, revealed details that challenged every assumption about the nature of Samuel Godfrey's ferry service. Meridian had returned to the commission offices 3 days after his assigned crossing, appearing haggard and disoriented. Blackwood noted that the experienced waterman, known throughout the parish for his steady nerves and practical disposition, seemed fundamentally altered by his experience. His usual confident bearing had been replaced by a nervous energy that manifested in constant glances toward the windows, as if he expected to see something approaching from the direction of the bayou. The pilot's most significant discovery concerned the ferry's actual route during the crossing. Using his concealed instruments and years of experience navigating Louisiana's waterways, Meridian had attempted to map their journey across what should have been the familiar expanse of Bayou Teche. Instead, his measurements indicated that the vessel had traveled through waters that bore no resemblance to any known geographical features in the region. According to Meridian's calculations, the ferry had initially proceeded in the expected easterly direction for approximately 5 minutes before veering into what he described as a tributary that simply did not exist on any map or chart. This phantom waterway had led them through a landscape that defied the typical topography of southern Louisiana. Instead of the expected cypress swamps and Spanish moss-draped trees, the banks were lined with vegetation that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight despite the morning sun. The water itself had undergone a transformation that Meridian found deeply unsettling. The familiar brown sediment of the Teche had given way to a clarity so complete that he could see to depths that should have been impossible in the shallow bayou. Beneath the surface, he had observed what appeared to be structures of unknown origin, their geometric patterns suggesting human construction, yet following no architectural principles he could recognize. These submerged edifices seemed to extend far beyond the reach of his vision, disappearing into darkness that his instruments could not penetrate. Most disturbing of all were Meridian's observations of his fellow passengers during this impossible journey. The 6 individuals who had boarded with him had maintained an unnatural stillness throughout the crossing, their eyes fixed on the horizon with an intensity that suggested they were seeing something beyond Meridian's perception. When he had attempted to attract their attention through subtle movements and gestures, they had remained completely unresponsive, as if existing in a state of suspended animation. The pilot had also noted changes in the ferry's other passengers, individuals who had not been present when the vessel departed from the western dock. These additional travelers appeared gradually during the crossing, materializing from the shadows cast by the ferry's unusual canopy. They bore the dress and appearance of people from various historical periods, some wearing clothing that predated the establishment of Louisiana as a state, others garbed in styles that would not become fashionable for decades to come. Meridian's training as a river pilot had taught him to observe details that others might overlook, and he had noticed that these temporal passengers shared certain characteristics. Their skin possessed the same unsettling pallor that marked Samuel Godfrey himself, and their eyes held a depth that suggested they had witnessed things beyond the scope of ordinary human experience. Most unnervingly, they seemed to recognize Meridian as an intruder in their midst, turning their attention toward him with expressions of curiosity mixed with something approaching pity. The return journey to what Meridian had assumed was the eastern dock had followed a route that defied his understanding of the bayou's geography. The ferry had navigated through waterways that seemed to fold back upon themselves, creating a labyrinthine network of channels that existed in defiance of physical laws. Time had become fluid during this portion of the crossing, with moments stretching into what felt like hours, while entire sequences of events compressed into the space between heartbeats. When the ferry had finally arrived at its destination, Meridian had found himself standing on a dock that appeared identical to the familiar eastern landing. Yet his instruments indicated they had traveled a distance that would have taken them far beyond the boundaries of the parish. The other passengers had disembarked with the same mechanical precision they had maintained throughout the journey, dispersing into the surrounding landscape as if following predetermined paths known only to themselves. Blackwood's transcription of Meridian's report concluded with the pilot's most troubling observation. As he had turned for one final look at Godfrey's ferry before departing the dock, Meridian had seen his own reflection in the dark water beneath the vessel. The face that stared back at him had been his own, yet somehow altered, bearing the same pallor and depth of expression that characterized the ferry's mysterious passengers. The realization that his brief journey had left some indelible mark upon his very essence had filled him with a dread that would haunt his remaining days. The weeks following Meridian's report marked a turning point in the Commission's investigation, as documented in Blackwood's increasingly erratic entries throughout May 1833. Dr. Whitmore observed that the Secretary's handwriting had deteriorated further, with ink blots and crossed-out passages suggesting a mind struggling to process information that defied rational categorization. The Commission found itself facing a crisis that threatened not only their administrative authority, but their fundamental understanding of reality itself. Blackwood's records indicated that the Commission had attempted to suspend Godfrey's ferry service pending a thorough investigation, but their efforts were consistently undermined by circumstances beyond their control. Official notices posted at the ferry landing would disappear overnight, replaced by schedules written in Godfrey's distinctive script that bore no resemblance to any authorized timetable. Passengers continued to arrive at the dock seeking passage, claiming to have received information about ferry services through channels that the Commission could not identify or trace. The situation became more complex when the commission discovered that Godfrey's ferry had become essential to the local economy in ways that defied logical explanation. Merchants reported receiving goods that had been transported across the bayou despite having no record of arranging such shipments. Plantation owners found their correspondence reaching distant relatives with impossible speed, as if the ferry service operated according to temporal principles that transcended conventional understanding of distance and time. Dr. Whitmore noted that Blackwood had begun documenting strange occurrences throughout the parish that seemed connected to the ferry's operations. Residents reported dreams of dark waters and phantom passengers, visions that became more frequent and vivid as the weeks progressed. Local physicians observed an increase in cases of what they termed melancholic displacement, a condition characterized by patients' insistence that they had traveled to places that did not exist on any map. The Commission's attempts to gather testimony from passengers who had successfully completed crossings on Godfrey's ferry yielded increasingly contradictory accounts. Some travelers insisted they had experienced perfectly normal journeys, while others described voyages through landscapes that bore no resemblance to the familiar geography of Louisiana. Most disturbing were the passengers who claimed to have no memory of the crossing itself, arriving at their destinations with gaps in their recollection that they could not explain. Blackwood's entries from late May revealed the Commission's growing desperation as they sought assistance from outside authorities. Letters had been dispatched to the territorial government in New Orleans, but responses were slow in coming and offered little practical guidance for dealing with a situation that existed beyond the scope of conventional administrative procedures. The Commission had also reached out to religious leaders in the region, hoping that spiritual intervention might provide solutions where secular authority had failed. The Secretary's records indicated that several prominent clergymen had visited the ferry landing to observe Godfrey's operations firsthand. Their subsequent reports, as transcribed by Blackwood, painted a picture of profound theological confusion. The ferry's existence seemed to challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of divine providence and human mortality, operating according to principles that existed outside the established framework of Christian doctrine. One particularly detailed account came from Father Augustin Moreau, a Jesuit priest who had served missions throughout the Louisiana Territory. After observing several of Godfrey's crossings, Father Moreau had concluded that the ferry operated as a form of purgatorial transport, carrying souls between states of existence that were neither fully living nor completely dead. His theological analysis suggested that passengers who boarded the vessel were participating in a form of spiritual transition that occurred outside the normal boundaries of earthly experience. The Commission's records from this period also documented their attempts to investigate Godfrey's background and origins. Despite extensive inquiries throughout the region, they could find no trace of the ferryman's previous employment or personal history. He seemed to have materialized at the bayou landing without any connection to the established networks of commerce and community that characterized frontier Louisiana. Blackwood's final entries from May 1833 revealed his growing conviction that the Commission was dealing with forces beyond their authority to regulate or control. The Secretary had begun to question whether their investigation was serving any useful purpose, or whether their continued scrutiny of Godfrey's operations was somehow contributing to the spread of the phenomenon they sought to understand. The chapter concluded with Blackwood's ominous observation that the ferry's influence seemed to be expanding beyond the immediate vicinity of the bayou crossing, affecting communities throughout the parish in ways that suggested a fundamental alteration in the fabric of local reality. Dr. Whitmore's examination of the ledger revealed a dramatic shift in documentation beginning in early June 1833. The meticulous entries that had characterized Jeremiah Blackwood's record-keeping gave way to sporadic notes written in different hands, suggesting that the Commission Secretary had ceased his regular duties. The final entry in Blackwood's distinctive script, dated June 2nd, contained observations that marked his complete descent into the mystery he had been attempting to document. The Secretary's last coherent report described his decision to conduct a personal investigation of Godfrey's ferry operations. Despite the Commission's official prohibition against further direct contact with the ferryman, Blackwood had become convinced that only through first-hand experience could he hope to understand the true nature of the phenomenon they were confronting. His final entries revealed a man consumed by an obsession that had gradually eroded his capacity for objective analysis. Blackwood had documented his preparations for what he termed his final crossing, with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his professional work. He had arranged for his personal affairs to be managed by his assistant, prepared detailed instructions for the continuation of commission business, and composed letters to his family that suggested he anticipated the possibility of not returning from his investigation. Most tellingly, he had begun to refer to the ferry not as a means of transportation, but as a gateway to understanding truths that existed beyond conventional human experience. The Secretary's account of his boarding of Godfrey's ferry on the morning of June 2nd provided the most detailed first-hand description of the vessel's interior that Dr. Whitmore had encountered in the ledger. Blackwood wrote of benches carved from the same unidentifiable dark wood that comprised the ferry's hull, their surfaces worn smooth by countless passengers whose identities remained forever unknown. The canopy that provided shelter from the elements bore intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change when observed directly, creating an optical effect that induced a state of mild disorientation in anyone who studied them too closely. Most significantly, Blackwood had observed that the ferry's passenger manifest, which Godfrey maintained with such precise attention to detail, contained entries written in scripts and languages that predated European settlement of the Louisiana territory. Names appeared in the ledger that belonged to no known historical record, suggesting that the ferry had been operating far longer than anyone had suspected. The implications of this discovery had filled Blackwood with a mixture of terror and fascination that permeated his final written observations. The Secretary's description of his fellow passengers during this ultimate crossing revealed individuals who bore the unmistakable signs of having made the journey multiple times. Their faces possessed the same ethereal pallor that characterized Godfrey himself, and their eyes held a depth of knowledge that suggested they had witnessed the ferry's true destination. Blackwood noted that these repeat passengers seemed to exist in a state of perpetual transition, neither fully present in the physical world nor completely absent from it. As the ferry had departed from the familiar dock, Blackwood documented his growing realization that he was participating in something far more significant than a simple river crossing. The vessel had entered waters that existed beyond the geographical boundaries of Bayou Teche, navigating through currents that flowed according to principles that defied conventional understanding of physics and navigation. The Secretary's final coherent observations described a landscape that seemed to exist in multiple temporal states simultaneously, with past, present, and future overlapping in ways that created a reality more complex than human perception could fully comprehend. Blackwood's last entry concluded with his acknowledgement that he had finally understood the true nature of Samuel Godfrey's ferry service. The vessel operated as a form of temporal transport, carrying passengers not merely across physical space, but through the boundaries that separated different states of existence. His final words expressed a mixture of wonder and resignation as he accepted his role as both observer and participant in a phenomenon that transcended the limitations of mortal understanding. The subsequent entries in the ledger, written by various commission members attempting to continue Blackwood's work, documented their frantic search for their missing secretary. Despite extensive efforts to locate him, no trace of Blackwood could be found. The ferry continued its regular operations under Godfrey's guidance, but the Commission's ability to monitor or regulate its activities had been effectively eliminated with the loss of their most dedicated investigator, Dr. Whitmore noted that the handwriting in these later entries betrayed the growing panic of officials who found themselves confronting a situation that had spiraled completely beyond their control. Dr. Whitmore discovered that the Commission's records following Blackwood's disappearance had been maintained by his assistant, a young clerk named Edmund Hartwell, whose inexperience with the investigation's complexities became immediately apparent in his uncertain penmanship and fragmented observations. The entries from mid-June 1833 revealed an organization in complete disarray, struggling to comprehend the loss of their most knowledgeable investigator, while simultaneously attempting to manage a situation that had grown beyond their administrative capabilities. Hartwell's initial entries documented the Commission's desperate attempts to locate Blackwood through conventional means. Search parties had combed the bayou's banks and surrounding swamplands, while inquiries were made at every settlement within a 50-mile radius of the ferry crossing. Local authorities had been notified, and notices had been posted throughout the parish offering rewards for any information regarding the Secretary's whereabouts. These efforts yielded no results, as if Blackwood had simply ceased to exist the moment he stepped aboard Godfrey's vessel. The young clerk's records revealed that the Commission had attempted to interview Samuel Godfrey directly about Blackwood's disappearance, but the ferryman's responses had been characteristically enigmatic. According to Hartwell's transcription, Godfrey had acknowledged that Blackwood had indeed been a passenger on his ferry, but claimed no knowledge of what had become of the Secretary after the crossing was completed. The ferryman's manifest showed Blackwood's name recorded in the same precise script used for all passengers, with no indication that his journey had differed from any other routine crossing. More disturbing were Hartwell's observations about changes in the ferry's operations following Blackwood's disappearance. The vessel's schedule had become increasingly erratic, with crossings occurring at times that bore no relationship to posted timetables or passenger demand. Travelers would arrive at the dock to find the ferry already departed, only to have it reappear moments later as if it had never left. Others reported waiting for hours at the landing, only to discover that the ferry had somehow completed multiple crossings while they stood watching the empty water. The Commission's records from this period also documented a significant increase in passenger complaints, though the nature of these grievances had evolved beyond the simple confusion and disorientation reported in earlier months. Travelers now spoke of encountering familiar faces among their fellow passengers, individuals they recognized as deceased relatives or long-lost acquaintances. These phantom passengers would acknowledge their living companions with subtle gestures of recognition before fading from view as the crossing progressed. Hartwell had attempted to maintain Blackwood's systematic approach to documentation, but his inexperience with the investigation's supernatural elements led to increasingly fragmented and contradictory reports. The young clerk struggled to reconcile eyewitness accounts that defied logical explanation with his responsibility to maintain accurate records for the Commission. His entries revealed a growing sense of inadequacy as he confronted phenomena that existed beyond the scope of conventional administrative procedures. The Commission's final formal meeting, as recorded by Hartwell on June 28, 1833, marked their official acknowledgement of defeat in their attempts to regulate or understand Godfrey's ferry operations. The remaining members had concluded that they lacked both the authority and the expertise necessary to address a situation that transcended the boundaries of normal human experience. Their decision to suspend all investigative activities represented a tacit admission that some mysteries were beyond the reach of bureaucratic intervention. Hartwell's records from early July documented the Commission's gradual dissolution as members resigned their positions or simply ceased attending meetings. The young clerk found himself increasingly isolated in his efforts to maintain some semblance of official oversight over the ferry's operations. His entries from this period revealed a growing obsession with understanding what had happened to Blackwood, and fixation that began to mirror the secretary's own descent into the mystery he had been investigating. The Commission's final official act, as recorded by Hartwell, involved the preparation of a comprehensive report intended for submission to territorial authorities in New Orleans. This document, which occupied the final pages of the ledger, represented their attempt to summarize months of investigation into phenomena that defied conventional explanation. The report acknowledged their complete failure to understand or control Godfrey's operations, while warning future authorities about the potential dangers posed by the ferry service. Hartwell's concluding entries revealed his growing conviction that the Commission's investigation had been fundamentally flawed from its inception. Rather than attempting to regulate or understand Godfrey's ferry through conventional means, they should have recognized it as a phenomenon that existed outside the normal boundaries of human authority. The young clerk's final observations suggested that the ferry operated according to principles that were neither malevolent nor benevolent, but simply beyond the scope of mortal comprehension. Dr. Whitmore noted that Hartwell's handwriting had begun to deteriorate in his final entries, displaying the same tremulous quality that had characterized Blackwood's later observations. The young clerk's last recorded entry, dated July 15, 1833, expressed his intention to conduct his own investigation of the ferry's operations, despite the tragic fate that had befallen his predecessor. Dr. Whitmore discovered that Edmund Hartwell's final entries had been written in a hand that grew increasingly unsteady with each passing line, as if the young clerk was struggling against some invisible force that sought to prevent him from completing his documentation. The last coherent records in the Commission's ledger, dated July 16th through 18th, 1833, provided a haunting account of Hartwell's decision to follow in Blackwood's footsteps and board Samuel Godfrey's mysterious ferry. Unlike his predecessor's methodical preparation, Hartwell's approach to his final investigation appeared driven by desperation rather than scholarly curiosity. His entries revealed a young man consumed by guilt over his inability to prevent Blackwood's disappearance and tormented by recurring dreams in which the missing secretary called to him from across dark waters. The clerk had become convinced that only by experiencing the ferry's true nature firsthand could he hope to understand what had befallen his mentor and bring some form of closure to the Commission's failed investigation. Hartwell's account of his boarding of the ferry on the morning of July 16th provided details that complemented and expanded upon Blackwood's earlier observations. The young clerk noted that Godfrey had greeted him with what appeared to be recognition, as if the ferryman had been expecting his arrival. The vessel itself seemed to have undergone subtle changes since Blackwood's disappearance, with new carvings appearing on the hull that depicted scenes of passengers in various states of transition between the physical and spiritual realms. The clerk's description of his fellow passengers revealed individuals who bore an unsettling familiarity despite being complete strangers. Among them, Hartwell recognized faces from daguerreotypes and painted portraits that had adorned the Commission offices, suggesting that previous investigators and officials had made similar journeys aboard Godfrey's ferry throughout the decades. Most shocking of all was his glimpse of Jeremiah Blackwood himself, seated among the other passengers with the same ethereal pallor and distant expression that characterized all of the ferry's regular travelers. Hartwell's observations during the crossing provided the most detailed account of the ferry's actual destination that Dr. Whitmore had encountered in the ledger. The vessel had navigated through waters that existed in a state of perpetual twilight, where the boundaries between past, present, and future seemed to dissolve completely. The young clerk described seeing events from Louisiana's history unfolding along the banks of this impossible waterway, with scenes of colonial settlement, territorial expansion, and future developments that would not occur for decades to come. The ferry's ultimate destination, as documented in Hartwell's increasingly fragmented prose, appeared to be a landing that existed outside the normal flow of time and space. This ethereal dock served as a gathering point for souls who'd become disconnected from the conventional progression of mortal existence, whether through tragedy, obsession, or simply an inability to accept the limitations of earthly life. Hartwell realized that passengers who boarded Godfrey's ferry were not merely crossing a body of water, but transitioning between different states of being. The clerk's final coherent observations revealed his growing understanding of Samuel Godfrey's true nature and purpose. The ferryman operated as a guide for souls caught between worlds, providing passage for those who could not find peace within the confines of ordinary existence. Godfrey himself appeared to be neither fully alive nor completely dead, existing in a liminal state that allowed him to navigate the boundaries between different planes of reality. Hartwell's last entries described his realization that he had joined the ranks of the ferry's permanent passengers, bound to continue making crossings between the world of the living and the realm of the departed. His acceptance of this fate was tinged with a strange sense of relief, as if he had finally found his proper place in a cosmic order that transcended human understanding. The young clerk's final words expressed gratitude for the opportunity to reunite with Blackwood and to serve a purpose greater than the mundane concerns of bureaucratic administration. Dr. Whitmore noted that the handwriting in these concluding entries had taken on the same precise quality that characterized Samuel Godfrey's own script, suggesting that Hartwell's transformation into one of the ferry's eternal passengers was already well underway. The ledger's final pages contained only blank entries, their emptiness serving as a silent testament to the complete dissolution of the Commission's authority over the mysterious ferry service. The absence of any subsequent documentation left Dr. Whitmore with the unsettling realization that the ferry continued to operate in the remote bayous of Louisiana, carrying passengers on journeys that defied conventional understanding of transportation, time, and the boundaries between life and death. Dr. Whitmore closed the ancient ledger with trembling hands as the Louisiana Historical Society's archive room seemed to grow colder around her. The autumn afternoon light filtering through the dusty windows had taken on an ethereal quality that reminded her uncomfortably of Hartwell's descriptions of the ferry's twilight realm. Her academic training had prepared her to analyze historical documents with objective detachment, but the Commission's records had challenged every assumption she held about the nature of reality and the boundaries between scholarly research and personal experience. The weeks following her discovery of the ledger had been marked by a growing obsession that mirrored the descent of Blackwood and Hartwell into the mystery they had attempted to document. Dr. Whitmore found herself returning to the archives daily, poring over the Commission's records with an intensity that concerned her colleagues and disrupted her other research projects. The ferry's story had taken hold of her imagination, with a grip that seemed to tighten with each reading of the testimonies and observations contained within the yellowed pages. Her attempts to verify the historical accuracy of the Commission's records had yielded frustratingly inconclusive results. Official territorial documents from the 1830s contained no mention of the Bayou Teche Ferry Commission, despite the detailed organizational structure and bureaucratic procedures described in Blackwood's meticulous entries. Local parish records showed no trace of Samuel Godfrey's employment or the mysterious disappearances that had plagued the ferry service throughout its brief documented existence. Most disturbing of all was Dr. Whitmore's discovery that several of the individuals mentioned in the Commission's records had never existed according to conventional historical sources. Jeremiah Blackwood, Edmund Hartwell, and even Thomas Meridian appeared to be fictional characters, yet their personalities and experiences had been documented with such vivid detail that they seemed more real than many verified historical figures she had studied throughout her academic career. The scholar's investigation had led her to the remote bayou region where the ferry crossing had allegedly operated, a journey that required several hours of driving through increasingly isolated Louisiana backroads. The landscape she encountered bore little resemblance to the geographical features described in the Commission's records. Yet she felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity as she explored the moss-draped waterways and abandoned settlements that dotted the region. At what appeared to be the site of the historical ferry landing, Dr. Whitmore had discovered the remnants of a wooden dock that seemed far older than any structure should have survived in the humid Louisiana climate. The weathered planks bore carvings that matched Hartwell's descriptions of the decorative elements found on Godfrey's vessel, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change when observed from different angles. Local residents, when questioned about the dock's history, provided contradictory accounts that ranged from complete ignorance of its existence to vague memories of ferry services that had operated decades before their own births. Dr. Whitmore's academic colleagues had begun to express concern about her prolonged focus on what they considered an elaborate historical fiction rather than legitimate research material. Her department chair had suggested that she take a sabbatical to recover from what he diplomatically termed research fatigue, but the scholar found herself unable to abandon her investigation into the ferry's mystery. The Commission's records had become more than a historical curiosity. They represented a challenge to her fundamental understanding of the relationship between documentation and reality. As she sat alone in the archive room on what would prove to be her final evening of research, Dr. Whitmore experienced a moment of profound clarity regarding the true nature of her discovery. The ledger was not merely a record of historical events, but a form of invitation extended across the centuries to scholars and investigators who possess the intellectual curiosity and emotional vulnerability necessary to appreciate its deeper significance. The Commission's story served as both warning and welcome to those who sought to understand mysteries that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional academic inquiry. Her final entry in her own research notes, written in a hand that had begun to display the same tremulous quality that characterized the Commission's later records, expressed her intention to visit the bayou landing once more. Dr. Whitmore had become convinced that only through direct experience could she hope to verify the truth contained within the ancient ledger, regardless of the personal cost such verification might entail. The Louisiana Historical Society's records show that Dr. Margaret Whitmore never returned the Commission's ledger to its proper place in the archives, and her subsequent disappearance remains unexplained to this day. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.